Remember correctly, that is when one person is developing a relationship with another person. So, one thing that we're going to be talking about for the next couple of days are gender norms and communication. If you see on your screen, you've got the man has just the on and off switch, whereas women, it is insinuating, have a lot of different buttons to be pressed, okay? So, we're just going to go ahead and dive right on into this. So, we're going to talk about stereotypes here really quick. It is super important to remember that not all men act the exact same way and not all women act the exact same way, okay? What we're going to be talking about today are things that are based on stereotypes. They're going to be things that are based on gender norms. And so what I mean when I say gender norms are going to be those perceptions that we have of men and women just as a whole, okay? So typically, yes, women are seen as more nurturing, whereas men can be seen as more aggressive. However, that doesn't mean that we don't have aggressive women or that we don't have nurturing men, okay? But we're going back to thinking at things on the whole, okay? So, and it's because of these things, because of these gender norms that exist, that we often have issues between men and women, especially when it comes to communication, which we kind of talked about before the break. So, we're going to talk about defining gender here just really quickly. So, your gender is your sexual identity in relation to society or culture, okay? Your gender is something that you can identify as. And yes, there's been a lot of talk in the media lately about how we define gender, so on and so forth. But for the sake of today's lesson and for the activity that we're going to be doing, this is how we are defining gender. We are going to take a look at it in reference to it as a social relationship and the roles and responsibilities of men and women in society. Okay. So, just generally speaking, some things that men value, as you can see on your screen, are independence, power, and accomplishments. And I think that that's a pretty well understood idea. We've seen a lot of men in positions of power over the years. Historically speaking, we've only had male presidents. When we think of CEOs, when we think of business owners, when we think of principals, we often think of men. But we're definitely in a time now where that's kind of changing. And I think that that's a really cool thing that we get to see. We get to see women step into roles of leadership and get to see them step into roles that have typically been held by men. Okay, so those are some things that men value. While if you look over at the other column, women value communication, connection, and relationships. And again, this doesn't mean that men don't value those things. That just means that generally speaking, this is where we stand. So, if you take a look at female communication, again, it's very much based on collaboration and relationships with people. Women tend to be very responsive when you say things, and I know that I can serve as an example of that for sure. I like to be very responsive when people are talking to me so that they feel like I am listening. Yes, typically women tend to be less aggressive or assertive, but again, that's just a norm and a stereotype. I can guarantee you that there have been plenty of times in my life where I've also been seen as aggressive or assertive, believe it or not, as somebody who is as loud as I am. I do tend to look a little aggressive and assertive sometimes. So, male communication, on the other hand, you'll see it in sports, you'll see it in the cafeteria, you'll see it in classrooms. Men definitely like to assert their status and assert their dominance. We even see it in school when you see guys kind of smacking each other on the butt. It's their way of kind of saying, hey, you're my friend, but this is the move that I'm making first, okay? There's some weird level of dominance that I don't quite understand, but it's a way that guys communicate with each other. So men are not afraid of interrupting people in order to gain the floor. And once again, men are typically associated with formal leadership and authority in a group, okay? So some different perceptions that men and women have are the fact that men typically look at things through a status lens, whereas women look at things through a connection lens. Men are often looking for a way to become higher status. They want to try to one up each other and achieve dominance, whereas women are typically looking to build relationships with people. Even if you remember back to your days on the playground, in a stereotypical world, you had boys running around, maybe wrestling with each other a little bit, whereas girls might have been sitting and playing in the sandbox. So unless you were like me, in which case you were like playing hide and seek with nobody else. Because you were like, all right, guys, let's go play. And then they were like, yeah, sure, Marissa, go ahead. And then I'd end up hiding behind a tree. Okay, so yeah, just looking at those different perceptions are really important. Gender differences in groups. Several ways that men and women differ in group interactions is through smiling, social behavior, verbal reinforcement, encouragement, and self-disclosure. Once again, women sometimes, if they're seen as too nice or if they smile too much, it might be misconstrued as some sort of flirtation on their part. Whereas if a man is giving verbal reinforcement or encouraging somebody in something, they might also be seen as flirting. So, studies have shown that women, more often than men, are sensitive to interpersonal meanings that lie between the lines when they exchange information with their partners. So, what that means is that to men, what's said is said, and what they say is exactly what they mean. Whereas women are often looking for an underlying meaning. And I think that that's where things get kind of murky and where our communication styles differ and why we end up with some kinds of issues sometimes. So, societal expectations often make women responsible for regulating intimacy. So, what that means is that women are often the ones to put up the boundaries. They choose how close they allow people to come to them, whether that's physically, emotionally, so on and so forth. And so, for that reason, sometimes it's argued that women pay more attention to the underlying meanings that messages imply. Men, on the other hand, and to a greater extent, are more sensitive about reading between the lines. Once again, they kind of see things in black and white. They want to be able to negotiate a hierarchy and figure out, who's the captain and who's the crew. They're not looking at those between the lines meanings. They're really just kind of looking at things at surface level and taking things at face value. So, a couple of listening rituals that make men and women a little different when they're communicating is that oftentimes men will avoid direct eye contact. They are probably listening even if they're not looking at you. However, they misinterpret direct eye contact with being either confrontational or flirtatious. Whereas women like a direct face-to-face gaze. It's because if you remember thinking back to the secrets of body language, somebody once said that if you can see somebody's eyes, you can see their soul. And that could not be more true when it comes to the listening with rituals of women. Their nonverbal communication is very much to kind of look at you, make sure they're seeing all of you. And if they're like me, they misinterpret no eye contact as somebody not listening to them. So, just a couple of other nonverbal things. This works really, really well in the classroom because as I'm explaining these, people kind of tend to look around and see that what they're doing is exactly what I'm talking about. But since we are not in the classroom, unfortunately, I won't be able to prove my point, but I think you can probably imagine what the classroom looks like and who's sitting where and how they're sitting and so on and so forth. Men usually take up a little bit more physical space. There's a term that has come into play recently called manspreading. It's just this idea that men take up a lot more space than is necessary. Their arms and legs are usually stretched pretty far away from their body, whereas women take up less physical space. They're usually sitting with their arms and legs towards their body, and they typically assume a more forward position to insinuate that they are listening, whereas men are not as sensitive to the communication cues of others. They might be a little bit more relaxed, reclined, leaning back when they're listening to somebody. So, How exactly do stereotypes affect gender and communication? So, various studies have revealed that both men and women exert greater influence when communicating in a gender stereotypical manner. So, what that means is that women are often more influential when they are seen as nurturing as and caring, whereas men, on the other hand, can be seen as more assertive and dominant when they exert those stereotypical attributes. So, highly dominant behavior by women is not surprisingly ineffective. Unfortunately, we still live in a world where if a woman's not smiling enough or if she's not wearing enough makeup, some people might say that she's got a little bit of RBF going on. Or they might tell her, you'd look a little bit more approachable if you smiled, okay? So, those are some things that just generally happen, and that's how some stereotypes can affect communication. So, as a result, women who are too competent at their skill may become disliked as people evaluate women who exhibit an exceptional level of competence a little bit more negatively than they view their male counterparts. People see having a female manager as having a less desirable personality because she is the boss and she is in charge. And a lot of that has to do with like the rhetoric that we use surrounding the way that we describe women and men, so on and so forth. But so that's just a little bit about gender norms and communication and the different communication styles. So your job over the next couple of days is to submit questions that you have about the opposite sex. And what I'll do is I'll post them in Google Classroom, and throughout the weekend and up until Tuesday, you guys have the opportunity to go in and you need to answer at least 3 questions that are posted. Thanks so much, guys. Have a great weekend, and I'll see you soon. Bye.